My name is Michaela and this is my YouTube channel. I've been posting videos to this channel publicly for a little over 3 years now. My YouTube anniversary is in October, so kind of right around this time of year. I do this mostly as a creative hobby, a creative outlet outside of work, and I really love doing it. I've always loved videography, photos. I was a theater kid, and then I've combined it with another love of mine, which is traveling, visiting national parks, hiking. Recently, as you may know if you've been watching my videos, I went on a solo trip to Oregon, and while I was doing one of the hikes there to Tunnel Falls, I was just kind of reflecting a lot, as I often do when I'm hiking alone, on traveling alone and what the experience has been like for me over the past few years since I started doing it. And I was thinking that it might be kind of helpful just to share my story. This video isn't necessarily going to be like a tips, how to travel alone type video, but I'm hoping that through sharing why I do it and why I love it, maybe it'll inspire other people or give other people the confidence to do so themselves. I made some notes in my phone to kind of try and keep myself on track, but it's basically just gonna be me talking. So here we go. Also, you may hear traffic. Hopefully it's not too distracting. We'll see. I wanted to start by kind of talking about why I love traveling and why it's something that I prioritize. And I think it really goes back to what I experienced growing up. My parents, probably when we were in 5th grade, took us on a vacation out to California to visit some family friends, and we visited the Redwoods as well as Yosemite on that trip. And my brothers and I fell in love with seeing national parks, being in nature in that way. And so 2 years later, we did a trip to Yellowstone. And yeah, that was probably one of the best experiences of my life. We had a rental car where my 2 brothers and I were in a back seat, just like 3 kids in a row. And at the time, you didn't really have a lot of electronics. We didn't have anything, but we were completing the Yellowstone Junior Ranger program, where they basically give you a little newspaper that has a bunch of activities and stops you have to do, rangers you have to talk to, and we got our Junior Ranger badges, which was really cool. We saw a lot of wildlife on that trip, including a grizzly bear super close up to our car. That just really formed within me kind of this passion for traveling and seeing nature and seeing kind of the incredible things that this world has. I also think that a lot of my love for traveling kind of comes from even further back. So I know my mom's parents always really loved to travel. They visited 49 of the 50 states. My grandparents took their kids on a long 2 or 3 week road trip out west. So my mom had that experience growing up, which really inspired her to share that with us as we grew up. And my dad was, of course, right on board with doing that. And so I'm really lucky that I got out to see a lot of really cool places as a kid. So fast forward to 2020. As we know, it was a crazy year for all of us. I was away from home. I was in a pretty intensive training program for my career, and COVID hit. And I think that all affected us each in different ways, but I know I felt a real sense of aloneness as a single woman in my 20s living by herself. And I just started to have these worries that I wouldn't be able to get out and do the things I wanted to do or see the things that I wanted to see in the world. Because I was realizing as I'd grown up that especially if you don't have a partner, there isn't necessarily a person or people available to go out and do the things that you want to do when you're free to do them. As things started to open up in the summer of 2020, I had a long weekend. So I think I had 4 or 5, I think it was 5 days off of work. And I decided, because I was living in Minnesota at the time, to do a road trip by myself through South Dakota and North Dakota. I ended up going a little further, and I went through parts of Wyoming and Montana as well. I planned it out so that I was going to be safe. I wasn't going to be in heavily populated public areas. And it was really the first time that I had done any extended traveling alone. I had traveled alone to get to the job interview in Minnesota and other types of things like that, but I had never really done a full 5-day alone experience. I drove through Sioux Falls to the Badlands to Custer State Park, and then I decided to go out to see Devil's Tower and drove up through Montana, and I visited Teddy Roosevelt National Park in the only state that my grandparents haven't yet been to. And then I finally made my way back over across the state, motorcycles, through Fargo and back to Minnesota. And that trip was life-changing. I think it proved to me, or I proved to myself, that I could travel alone and have a good time without anyone else there with me. The following summer, I planned an even larger solo road trip where I spent 21 days in the state of California driving basically a big loop. I have a video on that road trip that I made pre-YouTube and uploaded subsequently. But I spent the first, I think, 12 days of the 21 by myself, and then my mom flew out and joined me for the southern part of California. But again, I had a great time doing it alone. I started to really see some of the benefits of doing so, which I'll share later on. That was the summer that I moved back home to Cleveland, Ohio, and at that point I was fully sold on the fact that I can travel alone and I can enjoy traveling alone. The next big step that I took in this solo travel journey was my first backpacking trip, which I did alone. I had always wanted to go backpacking. I love the idea of backpacking, camping. My family was not a backpacking or camping family. I pitched a tent in the backyard as a kid because my parents refused to go camping anywhere else. I always had this belief that I needed to go backpacking with someone who knew what they were doing before I could go by myself, or with someone else who didn't know what they were doing. And so I think that was a pretty limiting belief, because I also didn't have any friends who routinely went backpacking or had ever gone backpacking. And so I didn't have people to reach out to do something with. I wasn't initially planning on backpacking on Isle Royale. I knew I wanted to visit Isle Royale National Park because I'm trying to visit all of the national parks. It was really only as I started researching Isle Royale that I realized, okay, backpacking is the best way to actually see and experience this park. And I like to find ways to really be in wherever I go in kind of the best way possible, or the most all-encompassing way possible. I thought to myself, maybe this is it. Maybe I just go for it. And I did a lot of research, read a lot of articles and blogs. I watched a lot of YouTube videos of other people who had gone backpacking, especially women who had gone backpacking. I read up on all of the gear that you need. I read up on what you need to do to be safe. And I did feel like I was somewhat safer doing that on Isle Royale initially, in that I stayed at 3 campsites over the course of the trip that were no further than probably like 9 or 10 miles from Rock Harbor, which is kind of the main port where all of the infrastructure is for the island. In planning that trip, I made sure to take a lot of safety precautions. I rented a Garmin InReach. I made sure that my family had kind of extensive idea and details of where I was going to be hiking and traveling. And then I was cautious on trail. I made responsible decisions. I didn't hike off trail. And I had a really good time. Again, I have videos from that experience as well. So that trip really gave me confidence, not only in traveling alone, because I was road tripping, hiking, backpacking alone for a week that summer, but also backpacking. Following summer, I decided to go on a much more adventurous backpacking trip. That was the summer that I hiked the Tour du Mont Blanc. For that trip, I was in Europe for 2 weeks by myself, and it definitely had its hiccups. I had some significant luggage delays that were pretty stressful. Ultimately ended up working out just fine. Since then, I've gone on a lot of other solo trips, near and far. I've done other week-long road trips. I hiked part of the Sky Trail in Scotland. I've done a lot of overnight car camping type trips. And I wanted to just kind of share some of the pros and some of the cons of traveling alone. So my pros of solo traveling. The first one is that you can go whenever you have the time to do so. And I think that's one of the biggest ones for me. I kind of touched on that at the beginning of my story when I was talking about back in 2020 when I knew I had 5 days and I didn't have anyone to go with me. I went because I had the time. And if I had waited because I didn't want to go by myself, I never would have had an opportunity to drive that road trip through those states and see 2 national parks, 3 national parks, Custer State Park, just beautiful places. Second pro is that when you're traveling alone, your itinerary is completely flexible. So when I'm planning trips, I typically kind of make out a plan for each day, and I'll typically list more things on my itinerary than I have time for. And I do that so that when I'm there, I can pick and choose what I want to prioritize, what I actually want to spend my time doing based on maybe what I did the day before, how I'm feeling, what I've heard since I actually got out to wherever I'm going. And that's worked out really well for me. But I think that can become more of a challenge when you're traveling with someone because there might be competing interests or desires. Now we got a fire truck. When you're traveling alone, you can prioritize your own interests, and that's the only thing that you have to worry about, which can be really freeing. I think also when it comes to especially hiking, you only have to take into account your own physical limitations. So on one hand, you won't be held back by someone who's not as physically capable of doing whatever you're doing. And on the other hand, you won't feel guilty about stopping 10 times up the mountain. I think ultimately the flexibility factor just makes travel in a lot of ways less stressful. I know that I can get more anxious when I'm traveling with other people because I want them to be having a good time. I'm worried about how they're feeling about things, if they're truly up for doing the things that I want to do, if they're feeling let down, if I don't want to do something that they want to do. Obviously, if you find the right travel partner and you communicate openly about that, you get over it and it's fine and it ends up working out in almost every case. But I do think that it's nice to not have that stress occasionally when you're traveling. The next thing on my list is when things don't go well, it's only going to affect you when you're solo traveling. And in those cases, it's really up to you to find the mental strength to get over whatever that struggle is, whether it's not having your luggage when you were supposed to have your backpack to go backpacking on the TMB, whether it's having food poisoning and having to go back to Edinburgh early. I think in some ways it's easier to know that it's only affecting you and it's up to you to make that bad situation into something positive that you're still going to enjoy. Maybe not as much as what you were originally planning, but to an extent that it's not so bad. My last pro is, actually no, I have 2 more. So first, opportunity to be creative. And I think for me specifically, that's in taking photos and especially making YouTube videos. I found over the last 3 years that one of the things I love most about traveling is figuring out how I'm going to make it a story and share it, trying to figure out how I'm going to capture a certain feeling or a certain visual. That's so rewarding to me to not only be able to share it, but also to know that I'll be able to look back and remember my experience at the time. I have made videos traveling with other people as well, but I certainly in those situations don't want the focus to be on me making my video. I want the focus to be on enjoying time with that person because that's a really valuable and special thing. And I never want to compromise the time spent with another person traveling by focusing on these creative endeavors. And so when I'm by myself, it's just much easier to fully invest into the creative side of it, which is just a different kind of fun. My final pro is that in my experience, when I travel alone, I'm more open to talking with people that are strangers. When I travel with friends or family, I have another person to turn to and talk to when I'm looking at, the Grand Canyon, whatever site I'm looking at. When I'm alone, I don't have anyone to automatically turn to. And so it's much easier to strike up a conversation with another person, especially if they're also alone. But I've even found it's easier to converse with couples, groups of people when I'm alone. And I think in part that's because people are kind and people recognize that you're alone and people understand that maybe you want to have a conversation. I think it makes you seem a little bit more approachable. Over the years, as I've traveled alone, I've had so many wonderful conversations with people from all over the United States, all over the world. And every conversation reminds me how alike we all are, or at least how much all of us care about the other people around us that we don't actually know. I don't know, it's hard to explain, but I've just had so many encounters where people are so kind. When I make my YouTube videos, I try to mention some of these encounters or conversations, not only to just share the positivity that I've experienced with the people who watch my videos, but also so that I remember those small encounters, because I think it's easy to forget all of the people with whom our paths have crossed. But every time I watch one of my own videos back, I remember, oh yeah, there was that group of botanists on the Isle Royal Ferry that I talked with the whole way over and then reconnected with on my last day. And that woman said that she was inspired to hike in the woods by herself, knowing that I was doing the same. So just things like that, I think it's a really good reminder that even when we're traveling alone in the world, we're not actually alone. All right. Now to the cons, because there are cons. The first con is probably the most obvious. It can be lonely. It can be very lonely. Most of my trips haven't been long enough or remote enough that I've felt this too intensely, but there have been a few times. I think one of the times that stands out is when I was hiking the Tour du Mont Blanc and I made it up to Refugio Elisabetta, which is in Italy, kind of up in the mountains. Beautiful refuge, beautiful place to stay, but I didn't have cell service, so I couldn't check in with my family, which is something I was doing in the evening, just briefly via text, sending a few pictures. And in addition to that, I didn't really connect with anyone in the refuge who also spoke English. The people at my dinner table didn't speak English, and I can't speak French or Italian, so I couldn't communicate with them. And I think these are things you have to be aware of. I was traveling in France, Italy, and Switzerland, and for the most part, I was so fortunate that the people in those countries are better at speaking English than I am at speaking other languages. But still, it's lonely, and it can be more lonely in some ways to be in a group of people where you can't communicate, and so you kind of feel left out or you feel that barrier. But I think that being lonely is something you have to be prepared for when you're traveling alone. And if anything, I think it's something you can grow from. I think it's something that's made me more comfortable in my day-to-day life. For example, I have no qualms about going and sitting in a restaurant completely by myself. Initially, I thought it was a really weird thing to do, to just go into a nice restaurant and ask for a table for one and sit there for 30, 40 minutes. It's not that weird. Like, it's fine. People don't care. You're paying. You can look at your phone, you can read a book. Ultimately, traveling alone helps you to build up more independence in your day-to-day life, which I think is important for anyone, regardless of whether or not you have a partner or other important people to lean on. The next con is that it can be more expensive to travel alone. So if you think of getting a normal hotel room, you're not going to be splitting that with anyone but yourself. And so I think that's impacted me in that I've had to be more conscientious of the types of places I'm staying. So I've oftentimes gone for cheap Airbnbs that don't have a bathroom. I car camp a decent amount, and that helps cut down on costs. I think backpacking, I've invested in a tent, but that also helps cut down on the cost of hotels, which really add up over the course of a trip. You also have to consider that you're not going to be splitting the cost of a rental car, which can also be quite expensive. I kind of touched on the next one already, but I think lacking a support system when things go wrong can be very challenging. And I think it's important that when you're traveling alone, you have people back home who are aware of where you are able to check in, touch base. And I think this is another way in which it helps you build independence, because you have to kind of become your own support system. You have to talk yourself out of negative thought patterns and work your way out of problems as they arise. The last thing is probably the most obvious and probably what a lot of people are most concerned about, especially women traveling alone, and that's safety. And I think that is something that is a really big barrier for people traveling alone. especially depending on the location that you are interested in going, it might not be safe to go alone. There have been times when I've showed up at a trailhead and maybe there's one other car with a person sitting in it, and I don't feel comfortable getting out and hiking by myself, and I leave. And I think that making those decisions, especially when there is any type of gut feeling that something could be off, is important. And it might mean that you don't get to do everything you want to do, but I think for me, knowing that I'm going to make those smart decisions when I do have a feeling that something isn't right is what makes me feel comfortable planning to do these things alone. In general, you have to be much more aware of your surroundings and commit to taking fewer risks. I know there's a lot more that I could go into in terms of what I do to stay safe, and there are a lot of really good videos. Someone's yelling out there. But there are a lot of really good YouTube videos by female creators outlining strategies to do so. So I've talked about my pros and cons for traveling alone, but I wanted to share just a few final thoughts or reflections on why I do it. And I think for me, it really boils down to the fact that traveling is really important to me. It's something that I love. It's something that I find joy in. It's something I prioritize. And that's not going to be true for everyone. I think it's totally fine if you're not interested in traveling near or far. I don't think that you need to do so to have a full life. But if it is something important to you, I think finding the courage to travel alone can open so many doors to see things and do things that you wouldn't have the opportunity to do otherwise. I know that's been true for me. I wouldn't have been able to do 50% of the things that I've done, probably closer to 80% of the things that I've done in the last 3, 4, 5 years if I had waited for someone to do those things with me. And that's just because schedules don't line up, people are busy, and it's hard to find time to do these things with someone else. Over the past few years, I think traveling alone has really helped me to build a lot of important life skills. It's helped me to become a better planner, a better problem solver. It's helped me to manage stressful situations better on my own. And I think it's given me a lot of confidence in terms of making a plan for myself and following through on it, and also in terms of talking with other people, with strangers that I meet. That's something that doesn't necessarily come naturally to me, but I think I've gotten a lot better at it over the years, in part because of my time traveling alone. The last thing that I wanted to touch on is whether or not I think traveling alone is better than traveling with someone. And my answer might surprise you. I actually think that in most cases, if it's the right person, it's better to travel with someone. There is something to be said for having someone to share new experiences with, having someone to lean on when things are hard, having someone to joke around with at all times. And while my experiences traveling alone have been magical in their own right, I've also had so many wonderful times traveling with family and friends. And I think, honestly, if given the choice of going somewhere alone or with another person, as long as it's the right person, I would be choosing to go with someone almost 100% of the time. I think the biggest benefit of traveling alone is that you can go wherever you want, whenever you're able to go there, and you have the opportunity to do whatever it is you want to do there. And that's a pretty magical thing. So I guess my hope with this video, if you've made it to the end, is that if you've had any kind of internal barriers or concerns about doing something like this, maybe you feel a little bit more inspired to do so. There's a lot of other content out there on the internet to help empower you to get out there. Again, to kind of go back to my mindset in 2020, we only have a limited amount of time here to pursue the things that we're passionate about. And so if there's a barrier or something holding you back, and if that barrier happens to be that you don't have someone to go do that thing with you right now, just do it yourself. Go on your own. Or work like crazy to find someone who can go with you. Maybe leave me a comment and I'll go. I don't know. But yeah, you know what I'm saying. So I think that pretty much wraps up the thoughts that I wanted to share. Not super instructional, probably not very helpful. It's just something that I was thinking about and I kind of wanted to put out there. So thanks for watching. I hope you have a nice night or day, nice life. If you made it this far, thanks for sticking with me, and you should click something up here, video, or subscribe. Bye.